People who live by the hormones of stress on a daily basis, and for the most part, that's 70% of the time for most human beings. And when you're living in stress, you're living in survival. And when you're perceiving some threat in your external environment, when you perceive a danger, you have the perception of something that could get worse, it turns on that primitive nervous system called your fight or flight nervous system. And when you're in stress, you're always trying to control or predict an outcome. So people who live under the gun of those chemicals, those emergency chemicals, are shifting their attention very quickly from one person in their life to another person in their life, to something at some place at some time, to meetings, to places they have to go. And every single one of those elements that are known in their external environment are neurological networks that are reflected in their brain. So under the urgency and the arousal of the stress hormones, we begin to shift our attention from one person to one thing. We activate these individual circuits. And like a lightning storm in the clouds, the brain begins to fire out of order, very incoherently. And when the brain is incoherent, you're incoherent. And when the brain isn't working right, you're not working right. And it's this state that begins to cause the brain to function like a house divided against itself. Different compartments of the brain no longer synchronize. And we've found the formula to teach people how to create more order and more coherence in their brain. And when they do this properly, without the aid of some type of drug, medication, or some type of external therapy, if they just practice that formula, they can begin to make their brain work better. When your brain is functioning right, you begin to see the world very differently. And so coherence then is when the brain starts to unify those different communities of neurons that were once subdivided. All of a sudden, you see the front of the brain start resonating and begin to oscillate with the back of the brain. You see the right side of the brain start synchronizing with the left side of the brain. And the brain is starting to function in a more holistic state. And what syncs in the brain links in the brain. And all of a sudden, you start feeling more whole. By the same means, when a person is living by the hormones of stress, there's only three things that primitive nervous system wants to do when you're living in survival: to run, to fight, or to hide. And because social mores say you can't fight, you can't run, or you can't hide, many times people are stepping on the gas because that emergency system is telling them to act. And yet they're in a business meeting, they're in the car with their children, they're on the phone with somebody, and it's those stress hormones that are beginning to activate the heart to race because blood needs to be pumped to the extremities in that state. But you're stepping on the gas, and at the same time you're stepping on the brake, and the heart starts to function incoherently. And when your heart functions incoherently, you stop trusting yourself. And all of a sudden then, the heart begins to send very, very inconsistent messages to the brain, and the person starts to move into dis-ease or imbalance. And so teaching people then how to create heart coherence and to create brain coherence and to synchronize coherence between their heart and their brain begins to make significant changes, not only in their health, but in their life. And by the same means, that when you begin to create brain and heart coherence, there's more energy going to the brain. And that energy then is causing the brain to function from a greater level of awareness or a greater level of consciousness. And I want to show you in this series how much energy the brain can tolerate when you start moving into these states. And not just a little change in energy, but a significant change in energy. This is happening independent of using some diet or changing something about yourself or exercise. This is about, by thought alone, being able to create more order and communication between your heart and your brain. And when you do, you have more energy in your brain to execute in your life, to be more present, to make better decisions, to think beyond the limitations or the conditions in your environment. In order for people to truly begin to make significant changes in their life, they have to get beyond the memory of themselves. Now let's talk about that. Your personality creates your personal reality. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So the present personality called you, who's watching this show, has created the present personal reality called your life. Which means if you wanted to create a new personal reality or a new life, you would have to change your personality. And as you begin to think about how you've been thinking, notice how you've been acting, and you begin to pay attention to how you've been feeling, the act of observing those states of mind and body begins to disconnect from everything known in your life. So if you wanted to create something new in your life, you would have to get beyond your present identity or personality. And when you begin to apply this formula, you'll begin to see significant changes, not only within you, but in the world around you. And so we've done extensive research to show that people can do this in a very short amount of time. In fact, we had a university in Australia on the Gold Coast called Bond University take a look at thousands of our brain scans. And they found that our community of people that had their brains measured were able to accomplish this feat in 4 seconds, in 9 seconds, in 15 seconds. In other words, they've developed the skill on how to get beyond their analytical mind, get beyond their personality in order to create something new. We also have done measurements to show that 80% of the people that had their brain measured had more than 90% change in their brain for the better just by applying this formula. I can also tell you in studying brains, in the process of change and transformation, that when you're analyzing your life within some disturbing emotion, that you're going to make your brain worse every time. Now think about this. Emotions are a record of the past. They are the end product of past experiences. And if you're living your life from some familiar emotion, and that emotion typically is driven by the hormones of stress, as long as you're thinking within that emotion, we could say then you are thinking in the past. That the solution to your problems is not thinking within that emotion. It's getting beyond yourself and beginning to get beyond the emotion, and when you do, you get beyond your past. And now you're no longer viewing your future or yourself through the lens of the past. The side effect of that is that you begin to see possibilities that you never saw before. So then, teaching people how to get beyond themselves and teaching them how to cease the normal analytical processes of how we begin to change and teach them another way to do it begins to produce significant and measurable changes in their life. In other words, it takes a long time for you as a personality to change your personality. It takes a long time for the ego to change the ego. It takes a long time for some subconscious program or some habit to change some habit. But the formula that we teach people on how to get beyond themselves allows them to become so conscious that they're no longer immersed in the personality. They're somebody else. And that is the first step to change. So how is this information changing the way we look at the world when we go from thinking to doing to being? I can stand here and tell you that when people begin to learn the proper information, and when you combine a little quantum physics with a little neuroscience, with a little psychoneuroimmunology, with a little bit of epigenetics, all of those sciences point the finger at possibility. So as people begin to learn information, and they can explain that information to someone, they're beginning to install the neurological hardware in their brain in preparation for an experience. They're making their brain fire in new sequences, in new patterns, and new combinations. And whenever you make your brain work differently, you're changing your mind. And the more that they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, the how gets easier. And the antithesis is also true too. If you can explain that information, it's not wired in your brain. So the purpose of the explanation process then, as we add new stitches into the three-dimensional tapestry of our gray matter, is we're doing this because we want to install that circuitry so that nothing is left to conjecture, nothing is left to superstition, nothing is left to dogma. That when people understand exactly what they're doing and why, and they assign more meaning to it, they put more intention behind it, and they get greater outcomes. So once people can understand that information from an intellectual, theoretical understanding in their thinking neocortex, if I can set up the conditions in the environment and give them the proper instructions, and they can get their behaviors to match their intentions and their actions equal to their thoughts, when they get their mind and body working together, they have some type of transformation. So what's the side effect of this process? We're seeing common people around the world doing the uncommon, in a sense, becoming supernatural. And I'm talking about healing from chronic health conditions, from cancer to diabetes, to Parkinson's disease, to lupus, to spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, to anxiety, to depression, and even rare genetic disorders that medical science has had no solution for. And when they reach this point, they're stepping back into their lives, supernatural. And what does that mean? They are greater than their bodies. They are greater than the conditions in their environment, and now they're in a whole new line of time. And as a result, not only do they change, but their life changes as well.